The wind didn't just howl that night. It screamed like a dying man, tearing through the Bighorn Basin with a fury that froze blood in the vein. They found the bodies later, 3 men, frozen stiff, but they never found the money. And they never understood why a hardened killer like Silas Mercer stopped his horse for a woman who looked more like a ghost than flesh and bone. She was starving, broken, and burying a secret that would burn the whole territory to the ground. This isn't just a love story. It's a confession written in gunpowder and blood. The snow had fallen for 3 days straight, burying the sins of Wyoming under a blanket of deceptive white purity. In the high country, near the shadowed crevices of the Bighorn Mountains, the temperature had dropped low enough to snap a pine branch, like a dry bone. Silas Mercer pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher, his breath pluming in thick, gray clouds before him. His horse, a towering roan gelding named Judge, huffed and stomped, fighting the drifts that reached past its knees. Silas wasn't a man who stopped for anything, not for weather, not for the law, and certainly not for pity. He had a job to do in Cheyenne, and a saddlebag heavy with gold coin that wasn't his, payment for a herd he'd driven up from Texas. He saw the wagon first. It was a pathetic thing, a buckboard with a broken axle, half capsized into a ravine just off the trail. The mule was gone, likely cut loose or dead and buried under the drift. Silas narrowed his eyes. The smart thing to do was ride past. In this territory, a broken wagon was often a trap, a lure for road agents to put a bullet in a good Samaritan's back. He reached down and unlatched the leather thong over the hammer of his Colt Peacemaker. He didn't draw it, just loosened it. "Easy, Judge," he muttered. As he drew level with the wreck, a shape detached itself from the shelter of the overturned wagon bed. It wasn't a bandit. It was a bundle of rags that slowly, painfully, rose to a standing position. It was a woman. She was wrapped in a woolen shawl that was tattered at the edges, the color of dirty dishwater. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones threatening to pierce through skin that was pale as the snow around her. Her lips were blue, cracked and bleeding, but it was her eyes that stopped Silas cold. They weren't pleading, they were furious. They were the color of burnt umber, burning with a desperate, terrifying will to survive. Clara Holloway had not eaten in 4 days. She had buried her husband, Thomas, 6 days ago in ground so frozen she'd only managed to dig down 2 feet before the shovel handle snapped. She had piled rocks over him to keep the wolves away, but she could still hear them howling at night. She stepped into the path of the massive roan horse, not caring if it trampled her. At this point, death by hoof was quicker than freezing by inches. Silas pulled back on the reins. "Get out of the road, lady. You'll get yourself killed." Clara didn't move. She couldn't feel her toes anymore, and the numbness was creeping up her legs, making her sway. She looked up at the man on the horse. He was terrifying, a scar running through his left eyebrow, a hat pulled low, and eyes that looked like they'd seen hell and decided to buy real estate there. "My husband is dead," she rasped. Her voice was thin, like wind through dry grass. The mule ran off. "I have nothing." Silas looked down at her, his face impassive. "That's a hard luck story, ma'am, but I ain't a priest." He made to kick the horse forward, but Clara lunged. She grabbed the stirrup leather with a grip that possessed a shocking amount of strength. "I don't want a priest," she screamed, the sound tearing at her raw throat. "I want to live." Silas looked at her hand on his leather, then back to her face. He saw the hollowness of her stomach beneath the rags. He saw the despair warring with pride. "Where's your home?" Silas asked, though he knew the answer. There was nothing out here for 50 miles, but rocks and wind. "The Holloway homestead," she lied. It was a shack, barely standing, 10 miles back the way he'd come. But it had 4 walls and a stove, if she could just get wood. "Take me home." Silas stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. The wind whipped around them, stinging his face. He knew who Thomas Holloway was. Everyone in the territory knew Thomas Holloway, a gambler, a cheat, and a man who owed money to people you didn't want to owe money to. If this was his widow, she inherited more than just a broken wagon. She inherited a target on her back. Silas looked at the darkening sky. If he left her, she'd be dead by sundown. If he took her, he was slowing himself down with dead weight. But Silas Mercer had his own demons. He remembered a face from long ago, a sister he couldn't save in a winter just like this one. He shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking loudly in the silence. He looked at her freezing hand, then up into those burning brown eyes. "Take me home," she repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper. Silas leaned down, his shadow falling over her. His voice was a low rumble, dark and dangerous. "I'll take you," Silas said. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "But," Silas added, his eyes locking onto hers, "I'll take you, too." Clara froze. The implication hung heavy in the frozen air. It wasn't a threat of violence. Exactly. It was a transaction. In the Wild West, nothing was free. Not water, not bullets, and certainly not survival. He wasn't offering charity. He was claiming salvage rights. She looked at the empty expanse of white death surrounding her. She looked at the warm, living horse, and the man who, despite his harsh words, was the only living thing that hadn't tried to kill her. Clara Holloway lifted her chin. She was a starving widow, yes, but she was a Holloway now, and she had learned one thing from Thomas before he died. "You play the hand you're dealt. Deal," she whispered. Silas didn't smile. He just extended a gloved hand. She took it, and he swung her up behind him with effortless strength. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in the sheepskin coat. It smelled of tobacco, horse sweat, and gun oil. To Clara, it smelled like life. "Hold on," Silas grunted, "and don't fall asleep. You sleep, you die." He kicked Judge into a trot. As they rode away from the broken wagon, Clara didn't look back at the grave of rocks she was leaving behind. She didn't know it yet, but the man she was clinging to was riding straight toward the very people who had put Thomas in that ground. The ride was a blur of misery. The wind picked up as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, turning the world into a landscape of gray shadows and biting cold. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her body instinctively tightening around Silas's waist every time the horse stumbled in deep snow. Silas could feel her shivering against his back. It started as a violent tremor and slowly faded into a dull, rhythmic shaking. He knew what that meant. Hypothermia was setting in. He needed shelter, and he needed it fast. He steered Judge off the main trail, heading toward a cluster of timber along the creek bed known as Dead Man's Fork. There was a line shack there, used by the Cattlemen's Association during the summer drifts. If luck was on their side, the roof hadn't caved in. "Wake up," Silas barked over his shoulder, nudging her with his elbow. "I'm awake," Clara mumbled, though her words were slurred. "We're here." "Get down." He slid off the horse and reached up to pull her down. Her legs gave way the moment they touched the ground, and she collapsed into his chest. Silas caught her, cursing softly. She was lighter than a sack of feed. He scooped her up in his arms, carrying her toward the dark outline of the cabin. He kicked the door open. It groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, it was pitch black and smelled of stale pine needles and rat droppings, but it was dry, and it was out of the wind. Silas deposited Clara on a wooden bunk in the corner. "Stay there." He went back out to tend to Judge, bringing the horse into the lean-to and securing the saddlebags. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had lived his whole life on the trail. When he returned to the cabin, he brought armfuls of dry wood he'd scavenged from the lean-to's supply. Within 10 minutes, a fire was roaring in the stone hearth. The light flickered across the rough-hewn logs, casting long, dancing shadows. Clara sat on the edge of the bunk, her shawl pulled tight. The heat hit her face, stinging her frozen skin. She watched Silas as he moved around the small space. He had taken off his hat, revealing a head of thick, dark hair streaked with early gray at the temples. His face was hard, the lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes. He pulled a tin pot from his gear, filled it with snow, and set it on the fire. Then he took out a block of pemmican and a small sack of coffee beans. "We need to get some heat in you," he said, not looking at her. He took a knife from his belt and began shaving the pemmican into the melting snow. Clara watched the knife. It was a Bowie, the blade long and sharp. "Why did you say that?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was stronger now, bolstered by the growing warmth of the room. Silas paused, the knife hovering over the pot. "Say what?" "I'll take you too." Silas turned slowly to face her. The firelight caught the scar in his eyebrow, giving him a menacing look. He wiped the knife on his trousers and sheathed it. "Thomas Holloway owed $3,000 to the Cheyenne ring," Silas said calmly. Clara's breath hitched. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Clara," Silas said. He used her name for the first time, and it sounded like an accusation. Thomas was a fool. He thought he could cheat Augustus Thorne at cards and get away with it. He ran out here to hide. "But you can't hide from the ring." Clara went rigid. Augustus Thorne. The name was whispered in fear across 3 states. He was a cattle baron who owned half the judges and all the sheriffs in Wyoming, Thomas said. "He said it was a business deal gone wrong," Clara stammered. "Thomas was a liar," Silas said flatly. He stirred the soup. "And now he's dead. Which means the debt passes to his estate. That wagon, that homestead. And you." Clara stood up, her legs trembling. "I am not property, Mr. Whoever you are. Mercer. Silas Mercer." He poured the soup into a tin cup and walked over to her. He held it out. "And I didn't say you were property. I said you were part of the deal." He forced the cup into her hands. Their fingers brushed. His were calloused and warm. Hers were ice cold. "Thorne has a bounty on Thomas," Silas explained, his voice lowering. "Dead or alive. But mostly, he wants his money. Or he wants something of equal value to make an example of." Clara stared at the soup, her stomach cramping with hunger. "And you? Are you one of Thorne's men?" Silas walked back to the fire and poured himself a cup of coffee. He took a long sip, staring into the flames. "No," he said quietly. "I'm the man Thorne sent to kill your husband. Looks like the winter beat me to it." Clara dropped the cup. It clattered to the floor, spilling the precious broth across the wooden planks. "You." She backed away until her back hit the rough logs of the wall. "You were going to kill him?" "I was going to bring him in," Silas corrected. "What happens after that is the law's business. Or Thorne's. You're a monster," she whispered. Silas knelt and picked up the cup. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. "I'm a survivor, Clara, just like you're trying to be. Now, pick up that cup. I have more soup. If you don't eat, you won't have the strength to hate me properly." He refilled the cup and set it on the bench beside her. Then he moved to the other side of the room, unrolling his bedroll near the door. He placed his Colt Peacemaker within easy reach. "Eat," he commanded. "Tomorrow, we ride for your homestead. We need to see if Thomas left anything behind that can buy your life back." "And if he didn't?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Silas lay down, pulling his hat over his eyes. "Then you better hope I can think of a way to convince Thorne that you're worth more alive than dead." Clara sat in the silence, the wind howling outside like a chorus of damned souls. She drank the soup. It tasted of salt and fat and life. She watched the sleeping form of the man who had been sent to make her a widow. He was dangerous. He was lethal. But as the fire crackled, Clara realized something terrifying. He was the only thing standing between her and Augustus Thorne. She finished the soup and curled up on the hard bunk. She didn't sleep. She watched the rise and fall of Silas's chest, plotting. If she could find the stash, Thomas had sworn he'd hidden the insurance. He'd called it she might have a chance. But she couldn't tell Silas. Not yet. Morning broke over the Bighorn Basin like a shattered plate, the sun struggling to pierce the leaden clouds that hung low over the peaks. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence that amplified the crunch of snow beneath Judge's hooves. Silas rode with the Winchester 1000, 873 rifle resting across his thighs, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. Clara sat behind him, her arms wrapped tighter around his waist than strictly necessary. The heat of him was the only anchor she had in a world that had turned white and hostile. How much further? Silas asked. His voice was rough, the morning coffee having done little to soothe his throat. Past the Sorrow Ridge, Clara murmured, pointing a mittened hand toward a jagged outcrop of granite. About 2 miles. It's a sod house near the creek, Silas grunted. He knew the type. A soddy dirt walls, dirt floor. A roof made of turf that leaked mud when it rained and dropped bugs when it was dry. It was the kind of home a man built when he had nothing but a shovel and a delusion. As they crested the ridge, the homestead came into view. It was a scar on the landscape. The roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow, and the chimney listed dangerously to the left. A single corral fence post stood upright. The rest were buried or broken. Home, sweet home, Silas muttered sarcastically. Clara felt a sting of shame. Thomas had plans. He was going to build a proper ranch house in the spring. Once the herd came in. There was never a herd coming in, Clara, Silas said, steering the horse down the slope. Thomas was a dreamer, and dreamers get eaten alive out here. They reined in near the front door, which hung off one hinge, banging softly against the frame. Silas dismounted first, his boots sinking into the drift. He reached up for her, his hands gripping her waist firmly to lower her down. For a second, just a second, she was pressed against him, looking up into his gray eyes. The air between them crackled, sharper than the frost. "Stay behind me," he ordered, releasing her and drawing his Colt. He kicked the door open. The interior was a wreck. Snow had drifted in through the broken window, covering the sparse furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that looked cold as a tombstone. "Start looking," Silas commanded, holstering his gun but keeping his hand near the grip. "If Thomas had money, where is it?" Clara moved to the bedroom, or what passed for it a curtained-off corner with a straw mattress. He said if anything ever happened, look to the hearth. He said the fire keeps the secrets. Silas walked to the fireplace. It was built of rough river stones. He knelt, pulling a heavy iron poker from the ashes. Loose stone? I don't know. I never looked. I didn't want to believe he was in trouble. Silas began tapping the stones with the handle of the poker. Thud, thud, thud. Then, a hollow clack. He jammed the poker into the mortar of a large, flat stone near the base and levered it. With a groan of friction, the stone shifted. Silas pulled it free, revealing a dark cavity behind the hearth. He reached in. Clara held her breath, her hands clasped at her chest. Silas pulled out a heavy, oilskin-wrapped package. It wasn't a sack of gold. It was rectangular, the shape of a large book. He stood up, dusting the soot from his knees, and carried the package to the table. He drew his Bowie knife and slit the twine binding it. The oilskin fell away to reveal a thick leather ledger and a bundle of papers tied with a red ribbon. "That's not money," Clara whispered, disappointment crashing over her. "That won't pay the debt." Silas flipped open the ledger. His eyes scanned the columns of neat, frantic handwriting. Dates, names, amounts, locations. "No," Silas said slowly, a cold realization dawning on him. "This is worth a hell of a lot more than $3,000. He picked up the bundle of papers. They were land deeds, dozens of them, some signed, some with signatures that looked forged, others with deceased, scrawled across the bottom. "What is it?" Clara asked, stepping closer. "It's leverage," Silas said, his voice grim. "This is Augustus Thorne's dirty laundry. These are records of bribes to the territorial governor, payoffs to the rail commission, and deeds to land he stole from homesteaders who accidentally died." He looked at Clara. Thomas wasn't just gambling with cards. He was blackmailing the most powerful man in Wyoming. "He stole Thorne's private ledger," Clara gasped. "He told me he was doing accounting work for Mr. Thorne. He said he was helping fix the books. He fixed them. All right. He stole the evidence." Silas slammed the book shut. "We have to go. Now." "Go where? To the marshals in Cheyenne?" "No. Thorne owns them. We need to get to the federal judge in Denver. It's the only way you survive this." "But..." "Shh," Silas hissed, his hand shooting up to silence her. He cocked his head. Outside, the wind whistled through the eaves, but beneath the wind, there was another sound, the rhythmic clop, clop, clop of horses. Not one, many. Silas moved to the window, peering through the cracks in the shutters. He cursed softly. "Who is it?" Clara asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Riders. 5 of them. Dusters. Long guns." Silas turned to her, his face hard as granite. "And leading them is Jebediah Rook." Clara had heard the name. Rook was Thorne's head enforcer, a man who reputedly cut out the tongues of sheep herders just to hear them try to scream. "They found us," Clara whispered. "They tracked the horse," Silas said. He shoved the ledger and papers into his coat pocket. "They don't know I'm here. They think they're coming for a grieving widow to shake her down for the book." He grabbed Clara by the shoulders. "Listen to me. There's a trap door in the pantry. It leads to the root cellar. Go. Now." "I'm not leaving you," she said, surprising herself. "This isn't a negotiation, woman. Get in the hole." "No." Clara grabbed a rusted double-barreled shotgun from above the mantel. She broke the breech. It was empty. She frantically searched the mantel for shells. "I can shoot. Thomas taught me." "Thomas taught you how to get killed?" Silas growled. But the riders were close now. He could hear the creak of saddle leather. There was no time to argue. "Fine," Silas said, pulling a handful of shells from his belt and tossing them to her. "You cover the back door. If anything comes through that wood that isn't me, you blow a hole in it. Do you understand?" Clara's hands shook as she loaded the shotgun, but she nodded. "I understand. And Clara?" She looked up. "Don't miss. Mrs. Halloway." The voice came from the front yard. It was smooth, cultured, and terrifying. "It belonged to Jebediah Rook. We know you're in there, darlin'. And we know you're alone. Your mule is dead on the road. Now, be a sensible woman, and come out. Mister, Thorne just wants his property back." Silas signaled Clara to stay low. He moved silently to the side of the front window, the Winchester raised. "I have nothing for you," Clara shouted, her voice wavering only slightly. "Now, that's a lie," Rook called back. "We know Thomas took the book. Send it out, and we'll ride away." "You have my word as a gentleman," Silas snorted quietly. Rook was about as much a gentleman as a rattlesnake in a silk hat. "I'm coming in, Clara," Rook shouted. "Don't make this messy." Silas saw the shadow move across the window. One of Rook's men was creeping toward the porch. Silas didn't wait. He smashed the barrel of the Winchester through the glass and fired. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. The man on the porch spun backward, clutching his chest, pink mist spraying the snow. "Ambush!" Rook screamed. "Burn it down! Get the torches!" Bullets began to tear through the sod walls. Puffs of dirt exploded inward, filling the room with dust. Silas ducked, pumping the lever of his rifle. He popped up, fired a shot at a man taking cover behind the water trough, and ducked again as a return volley shattered a clay jar on the table. "Back door!" Silas roared. Clara spun toward the rear of the cabin just as the heavy wooden door splintered inward. A boot kicked it open, and a man with a bandana over his face surged in, a revolver raised. Clara didn't think. She didn't breathe. She pulled both triggers. The shotgun roared like a cannon. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, knocking her backward onto the floor. The man in the doorway seemed to be lifted off his feet by an invisible giant. He flew backward into the snow, his chest a ruin. "Reload!" Silas yelled, firing 2 more shots out the front. "They're circling." Smoke filled the small room, acrid and blinding. Silas grabbed Clara, hauling her to her feet. "We can't stay here. They'll torch the roof. Where do we go?" Clara coughed, her ears ringing. "The creek. The banks are steep. We can use the cut for cover." Silas kicked the back door fully open, stepping over the body of the man Clara had killed. "Run! Keep your head down." They sprinted into the freezing air. The snow was knee-deep. They scrambled toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed. "There. By the trees." Rook's voice rang out, A bullet whizzed past Clara's ear, like an angry hornet. Another kicked up snow at Silas's feet. "Jump!" Silas commanded as they reached the edge of the creek bank. They slid down the 10-foot embankment, tumbling through snow and frozen mud, landing hard on the ice of the frozen creek. "Are you hit?" Silas asked, checking her quickly. "No, Crack. A rifle shot from the ridge above echoed. Silas jerked violently, spinning around. He grabbed his left upper arm, a grunt of pain escaping his clenched teeth. "Silas, move!" he snarled, shoving her forward with his good arm. Under the bridge, they scrambled beneath a crude wooden bridge that spanned the creek further down. The shadows hid them. Above, they could hear the horses thundering, their hooves hollow on the planks overhead. "They went east," one of the riders shouted. "I saw tracks leading to the timber. Go," Rook commanded. "Don't let them lose us in the trees." The sound of the horses faded, moving away from them. Silas sagged against the wooden piling, sliding down to sit on the ice. His face was gray, drained of color. Clara dropped to her knees beside him. "Let me see." "It's nothing," Silas grit out. "Just a scratch." She pushed his hand away. The sleeve of his sheepskin coat was soaked in dark, hot blood. The bullet had gone through the meat of his shoulder. Not bone-shattering, but messy. And in this cold, shock was the real killer. "We need to stop the bleeding," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. The panic of the shootout had been replaced by a cold, clinical focus. She was a farmer's daughter. She had seen animals bled and butchered. This was just flesh and blood. She tore a strip from her petticoat. "Take the coat off." "If I take it off, I'll freeze," Silas argued, his teeth beginning to chatter. "If you don't, you'll bleed to death. Jack it off. Now." Silas looked at her. The scared widow from the wagon was gone. In her place was a woman with eyes like flint. He nodded weakly and struggled out of the heavy coat. Clara worked quickly. She packed the wound with snow to numb it and constrict the vessels, then bound it tight with the cotton strips. Silas groaned, his head falling back against the wood, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "You saved my life back there," Silas murmured, his eyes half closed. "You saved mine first," Clara replied, tying off the knot. She helped him wrestle the coat back on, draping it over his good shoulder. She sat back on her heels, looking at him. He was vulnerable now, his lethal grace compromised by pain. "Why are you doing this, Silas?" she asked softly. "You could have taken the ledger and left me. You could have ridden off while they were shooting." Silas opened his eyes. They were hazy with pain but still intense. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, startling them both. "I told you," he whispered, his voice rough. "I don't leave things behind. Is that all I am? A thing?" Clara challenged, though her heart was racing. Silas looked at her lips, then up to her eyes. "No. You're the only honest thing I've found in this territory in 10 years. He coughed, wincing. "We can't stay here. Rook will figure out he lost the trail and circle back. We need to get to the high pass before the storm hits tonight." "You can't ride," Clara said. "I can ride," Silas insisted, struggling to stand. He swayed, and Clara caught him, her small frame straining under his weight. "Lean on me," she said. "I'm heavy, Clara." "I'm stronger than I look," Silas Mercer. They moved out from under the bridge, two dark figures against the white expanse. The snow began to fall again, large flakes that promised to bury the world. Silas Mercer, the feared bounty hunter, leaned heavily on the starving widow. Their fates knotted together like a hangman's noose. They had the evidence to bring down a kingdom. But first, they had to survive the night. And somewhere in the distance, Jebediah Rook was turning his horse around. The world had reduced itself to the rhythmic crunch of snow and the labored breathing of the horse. The storm that Silas had predicted rolled down from the peaks like an avalanche of white darkness, swallowing the moon and the stars. Clara walked beside Judge, her hand gripping the bridle so tight her fingers felt welded to the leather. Silas was slumped over the saddle horn, his consciousness flickering like a candle in a gale. The blood loss had sapped his strength, and the bitter cold was doing the rest. Every few minutes, he would mutter something incoherently, names of people long dead, warnings about trails that didn't exist. Just a little further, Clara lied to the horse, to Silas, and mostly to herself. They were high in the pass now, an area known as the Devil's Anvil. The wind here didn't blow. It scoured. It stripped the heat from their bodies with malicious efficiency. Clara couldn't feel her feet. She knew the signs of frostbite were setting in, but stopping meant death. Judge stumbled, his front knee buckling. Silas groaned, sliding dangerously to the side. Clara threw her weight against his leg, shoving him back upright with a scream of effort that was lost in the wind. "Stay on," she shrieked. "You don't get to die on me, Silas Mercer. Not after what you put me through." Silas lifted his head. His eyes were glassy, the pupils blown wide. "Leave me," he rasped. "Take the book run." "Shut up," she hissed. Ahead, through the swirling curtain of snow, she saw a shadow darker than the rest. It was a fissure in the rock face, a shallow cave mouth protected by a jagged overhang. "There," she gasped. She led the horse into the shelter. It wasn't deep, barely 10 feet, but it was out of the wind. She coaxed Judge to the back of the cave and then turned to Silas. "Get down," she ordered. He tried, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He fell more than dismounted, hitting the stone floor with a heavy thud. Clara was on him instantly, dragging him further away from the entrance. He was burning up. Even through his heavy coats, she could feel the heat radiating from him. The wound in his shoulder was angry and inflamed, and the cold had shocked his system into a fever. "Fire," Clara muttered. "We need fire." There was no wood here, only rock and ice. She looked at the saddlebags. She looked at the scrub brush clinging to the cliff edge outside. It wasn't enough. She turned to the saddle. She stripped the blanket from under it. Then, she made a decision. She opened the saddlebag and pulled out the ledger, the book that men had died for, the book that could hang the most powerful man in Wyoming. She tore out a handful of pages. "No," Silas croaked, his hand feebly grabbing her wrist. "The evidence. Evidence doesn't keep us warm," Clara snapped. She crumpled the pages, shoving them into a small pile of dry moss she found in a crevice. She struck a match, shielding the flame with her body. The paper caught. The ink of Augustus Thorne's sins turned to ash and heat. She fed the fire sparingly, adding dried dung and twigs she scavenged from the cave floor. It was a pathetic fire, barely enough to warm a tin cup, but it was light. Silas was shivering violently now, his teeth chattering with a sound that filled the small space. The fever was spiking, but his body core was freezing. It was a lethal combination. Clara knew what she had to do. It was a survival tactic whispered about by trappers, a last resort when the blankets weren't enough. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She began to unbutton his coat. It was stiff with frozen blood. She peeled it off him, then his shirt, leaving his chest bare to the flickering firelight. The wound was ugly, purple and swollen, but the bleeding had stopped. Then, she unbuttoned her own dress. She hesitated for only a second, the biting cold of the cave air hitting her skin. She stripped down to her chemise and petticoats, then lay down on the hard stone beside him. She pulled the sheepskin coat and the saddle blanket over both of them, creating a cocoon. She pressed her body against his. He was like ice on the outside, a furnace on the inside. She wrapped her arms around him, her head resting on his good shoulder, her legs entwined with his. "Clara?" he murmured, his voice thick with delirium. "I'm here, Silas. I had a sister," he whispered. "Sarah?" She froze. "In '88. I couldn't get the fire started." Clara stroked his hair, her fingers brushing the scar on his brow. "You have a fire now, Silas." "I see her," he said, his body tense. "She's waiting. She can wait a little longer," Clara said fiercely. "You belong to me right now. You said you'd take me home. A deal is a deal." Silas turned his head, his face inches from hers in the dark warmth of the blankets. His eyes focused on her, lucid for a fleeting moment. He looked at her not as a burden, or a job, or a widow, but as the woman who had walked into hell to drag him out. "You're stronger than her," Silas breathed. "Stronger than me. Rest, Silas." He closed his eyes, his breathing slowly sinking with hers. Clara lay awake, listening to the wind howl outside, guarding the man who had come to kill her husband and had ended up saving her soul. She held him tight, sharing her warmth, willing her own life force into his broken body. That night, in the dark of the Devil's Anvil, the starving widow died. And something else, something harder, fiercer, and infinitely more dangerous was born in the ashes of the ledger pages. The sun was blinding. It bounced off the snow with a brilliance that seared the eyes. Clara woke to the smell of coffee. She sat up, the blankets falling away. She was alone in the makeshift bed. Silas was sitting near the cave entrance, fully dressed, his arm in a makeshift sling. He was boiling snow in the tin cup over a small fire he must have stoked. He looked terrible pale, with dark circles under his eyes and a sheen of sweat on his forehead, but he was upright. And he was holding his gun. "Morning," he said. His voice was raspy, but the delirium was gone. Clara hurriedly adjusted her dress, cheeks flushing as the memory of the night flooded back. "You shouldn't be up. If I stay down, we die," Silas said flatly. He poured the coffee into the cup and handed it to her. "Drink. We ride in 10 minutes. Ride where?" "The pass is blocked. There's a mining outpost 5 miles east. Blackwood Ridge. I know the foreman, a man named O'Malley. We can get fresh horses and a doctor there." Clara took the cup. "Can we trust him?" Silas checked the cylinder of his revolver. "I trust him more than the weather. And a lot more than Rook." They mounted Judge together. The horse was rested but hungry, nipping at the dry scrub. Silas sat behind her this time, his good arm wrapped around her waist, the reins in her hand. It was a reversal of roles, a silent acknowledgement of her new status. The ride to Blackwood Ridge was tense. The landscape was a majesty of terror, sheer cliffs, towering pines, and the ever-present threat of avalanches. They reached the outpost by midday. It was a cluster of rough-hewn buildings, clinging to the side of a mountain, surrounded by the skeletal remains of mining equipment. Smoke curled from the main chimney. "Stay sharp," Silas murmured into her ear. "If anything feels wrong, you kick this horse and you don't look back." They rode into the muddy yard. A man stepped out onto the porch of the main cabin. He was big, bearded, with a belly that strained his suspenders. "Silas Mercer!" The man boomed, a wide grin splitting his face. "I thought the devil finally dragged you down to hell." "Not yet, O'Malley," Silas called back, though Clara could feel him tensing against her back. "Just passing through. Need supplies and a fresh mount." O'Malley's eyes flicked to Clara, then to Silas's bandaged arm. A flicker of something, greed, fear, passed over his face, gone in an instant. "Well, come on in. Coffee's hot and the stew is thick. You look like you've been chewed up and spat out." They dismounted. Silas leaned heavily on Clara as they walked up the steps. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of tobacco and stew. 2 other men were sitting at a table in the corner playing cards. They stopped and stared as the pair entered. "Friends of yours?" Silas asked O'Malley, nodding at the men. "Just some prospectors passing through," O'Malley said, waving a hand. Sit. Sit. Let me look at that arm." Clara helped Silas to a chair. She kept her hand near the pocket of her dress, where she had hidden the remaining pages of the ledger. She didn't like the way the prospectors were looking at them. They didn't look like miners. Their hands were too clean, and their guns were tied low. O'Malley bustled around, pouring coffee. "So, what brings you up this high in a storm, Silas?" "And with a lady?" "Business," Silas said shortly. "We need a horse, O'Malley. And some ammunition." Sure, O'Malley said. He set a mug down in front of Silas. "But tell me, is it true what they say? That you're carrying something for Augustus Thorne?" The room went deathly still. Silas's hand drifted toward his lap. Who says that? Word travels, O'Malley said, his smile tight. Telegraph line runs to the junction now. Got a wire this morning, said a man matching your description, riding a roan with a woman. Said there's a $5,000 reward for them. $5,000. It was a fortune. Enough to retire, enough to kill a friend for. Clara saw O'Malley's hand inch toward the shotgun leaning against the counter. Don't do it, O'Malley, Silas warned, his voice low and dangerous. 5,000. Silas, O'Malley said, sweat beading on his lip. I got a debt. To the bank. I can't let you walk out. He's not your friend, Silas, Clara screamed. The room exploded into motion. O'Malley grabbed for the shotgun. Silas, despite his injury, was faster. He kicked the table, sending it crashing into O'Malley's legs. The shotgun blasted into the ceiling, raining plaster down on them. The two men in the corner stood, drawing their revolvers. Get down, Silas roared, shoving Clara to the floor. He fired from the hip. One of the prospectors spun around, clutching his shoulder. The other fired, the bullet shattering the whiskey bottle on the shelf behind Silas. Clara scrambled on the floor, the wood splinters digging into her palms. She saw O'Malley struggling to rack the shotgun. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her might. It connected with O'Malley's knee with a sickening crunch. He howled, dropping the gun. Silas fired again, hitting the second prospector in the leg. The room was filled with smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire in a confined space. Out the back, Silas yelled. He grabbed Clara with his good hand, and they barreled through the rear door into the snow. They'll pin us down, Clara gasped. The mine. Silas pointed to the dark maw of a tunnel entrance, 50 yards up the slope. If we get into the tunnels, we can lose them. They ran. Behind them, O'Malley was shouting orders. Bullets kicked up snow around their feet. Silas stumbled, his strength failing him. But Clara hauled him up. Move, damn you, she cried. They reached the mine entrance, plunging into the cool, damp darkness just as a volley of shots chipped the stone archway. Silas collapsed against the wall of the tunnel, gasping for air, blood seeping through his bandages again. We're trapped, he wheezed. This mine, it dead ends. Clara looked at him, then back at the light of the entrance where shadows were already moving. No, she said, her eyes adjusting to the dark. She remembered something Thomas had told her about mines. Ventilation shafts. There has to be a shaft. She grabbed Silas's face, forcing him to look at her. We are not dying in a hole, Silas. We are going to kill them, all of them. Silas looked at her and grinned a bloody, feral grin. I think I'm a bad influence on you, Mrs. Halloway. Give me the gun, she said. What? You can barely stand. Give me the gun. You reload. I shoot. Silas hesitated, then handed her the peacemaker. It was heavy, smelling of burnt powder. It felt like judgment. Here they come, Silas whispered. Silas began to load shells into the Winchester with agonizing slowness, while Clara leveled the heavy revolver at the circle of light that was their only exit. Shadows stretched long into the tunnel. Come out, Mercer, O'Malley's voice echoed, distorted by the stone. There's nowhere to go. Rook is on his way. He'll be here by sundown. Rook. He was coming. The noose was tightening. Clara cocked the hammer. The click echoed like a thunderclap in the silence. Let him come, Clara whispered. I've got a bullet for him too. The mine tunnel was a throat of stone, swallowing the light. Bullets chipped away at the rock face inches from Clara's head, sending stinging shards into her cheek. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and the acrid bite of gunpowder. Keep moving, Silas rasped. He was dragging his right leg now, the blood from his shoulder soaking through the fresh bandages. He was a dead man walking, kept upright only by the sheer force of will and the woman beside him. It's a dead end, Silas, Clara shouted over the roar of O'Malley's shotgun echoing down the shaft. Look up. Silas choked out. Above them, a rusted iron ladder clung to a ventilation shaft, a slender thread of hope leading to a tiny square of daylight 50 feet up. Go, Silas commanded. I'll hold them here. You can't hold anything, Clara screamed, grabbing his lapels. Her eyes were wild, fierce, and beautiful in the gloom. Climb, or I swear to God I will shoot you myself to save O'Malley the trouble. Silas saw the steel in her eyes. He grunted, holstered his Colt, and hauled himself up the rotting rungs. Clara followed, the heavy Winchester slung across her back. Below, shadows detached themselves from the darkness. There they are, a voice bellowed. Shoot them down like rats. A bullet sparked off the iron rung just below Clara's foot. She scrambled higher, the rust flaking off under her desperate grip. They climbed through the suffocating darkness until Silas reached the top, heaving himself over the lip of the shaft. He grabbed Clara's wrist, hauling her up just as a shotgun blast roared from the depths. They collapsed on the snow, gasping. They were high up on the ridge now, the wind screaming across the exposed rock. We made it, Clara panted. Not yet, Silas said, his voice cold. He was looking north. Sitting on a black stallion, silhouetted against the storm clouds like a horseman of the apocalypse, was Jebediah Rook. He was flanked by 3 men. They hadn't come through the mine. They had ridden the switchbacks to cut off the escape. Rook smiled a slow, terrible expression. Mrs. Holloway, he called out over the wind. You are a difficult woman to kill. Silas struggled to his feet, shielding Clara with his body. It's over, Rook. The marshals are on their way. A nice bluff. Mercer, Rook sneered, dismounting. Give me the book. Refuse, and I have a lot of frustration to work out. Silas's hand hovered over his gun. He had 1 bullet left. He was weak, slowing down. Rook was fresh. The math didn't work. Run, Clara, Silas whispered. When I draw, jump off the ridge. No, Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. She stepped out from behind Silas. You want the book? She reached into her bodice and pulled out the oilskin packet. Rook's eyes glittered with greed. Smart girl. Bring it here. Clara walked forward. She stopped 10 paces from him. Thomas died for this. I just want to go home. Thomas was a thief. Rook sneered. He reached out his hand. Clara looked at him, then passed him to Silas. Silas, drop. Silas dropped to his knees. Clara didn't hand over the book. She threw it hard, straight into Rook's face. The heavy ledger struck Rook across the nose, blinding him. In that split second, Clara dropped to a crouch, levered the Winchester, and fired from the hip. The bullet caught Rook in the stomach, folding him over. Kill them, Rook screamed. The 3 men behind him raised their rifles. Bang! Silas fired his last shot, dropping the man on the left. The other 2 opened fire. Clara worked the lever of the Winchester crack thud. She hit the second man in the leg, but the third man, a calm professional, took careful aim at Clara. Silas saw it. He couldn't reach her. He couldn't shoot. He lunged. He threw his body across the space between them, slamming into Clara just as the rifle cracked. The bullet meant for her heart buried itself in Silas's back. They tumbled into the snow. Clara scrambled up, screaming. She raised the Winchester. It clicked empty. The gunman smiled, racking another round. Suddenly, his head snapped back. A small hole appeared in his forehead, and he crumpled. Clara spun around. O'Malley was standing at the top of the ventilation shaft, clutching his bleeding knee, a smoking revolver in his hand. I didn't do it for you, O'Malley spat, sinking to the ground. Rook called me a rat. Nobody calls me a rat. O'Malley slumped over, dead from the exertion before he hit the snow. Clara dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside Silas. The snow around him was turning crimson. Silas, she sobbed, pressing her hands against his back. Stay with me. He turned his head slowly, his eyes dimming. Did we get him? We got him, Clara cried. Now get up. You promised. I think. The deal is done, Clara. No. You said I'll take you too. You don't break a deal, Silas Mercer. Bossy woman. He wheezed. He tried to lift his hand, and she caught it, pressing it to her lips. I ain't dying yet. Too cold to die. 6 months later, Spring had come to the Bighorn Basin, turning the white hellscape into a riot of green. Augustus Thorne was awaiting a federal hanging in Denver, his empire crumbled by the ledger that survived the fire. 5 miles outside Cheyenne, a new house stood on a ridge. It wasn't a soddy, it was timber and stone. Clara walked out onto the porch. She looked healthy, the gauntness gone. At the corral, a man was working a young colt. He moved with a slight limp, favoring his right leg, but he was strong, alive. Silas Mercer wiped sweat from his brow and saw her watching. He walked to the fence. The scar on his eyebrow was white against his tanned skin. "Supper's ready," she said. "I'll be there," he promised, taking her hand over the rail. "You saved me, Clara." "We saved each other," she corrected. "Clara?" "Yes, Silas?" "I took you home," he said, gesturing to the life they had built. Clara looked at the house, then back at the man who had stopped for a starving widow in a blizzard. "Yes," she said, her eyes shining. "You did." "And?" Silas asked, a mischievous glint in his eye. "And," Clara said, leaning over the fence to kiss him. "You took me, too." And so, the snow melted. But the legend of Silas and Clara only grew. They proved that in the unforgiving West, the strongest weapon wasn't a gun, it was the refusal to let go of the hand you're holding. If this story warmed your heart, or kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It helps us tell more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Share this with someone you'd ride through a blizzard for. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next trail.